So thank you all for coming this evening. My name is Johanna and I'm the Talks Programmer at the Photographers Gallery. Some of you will know that this talk is part of a series that we're running in the year when we're refurbishing our building on Ramilly Street here at the Architectural Association on photography in the built environment. So this is the third talk in a series of 6 that we're running monthly here. Just so before we start, I've been asked to ask you all just to double check that your mobile phones are off. And that's not just in case you interrupt the flow of the speaker, but it's also because the microphones will sort of be affected and it'll go do all sorts of funny things. So this evening we're delighted to have the British photographer David Spero speaking, who's presenting 2 specific projects in relation to structures built in conjunction with ideological beliefs in Britain, and an approach to representing buildings which have been created around ideas. So I think we're just going to go straight into it. Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna, and good evening. Thanks, everyone, for coming along. And as Johanna was saying, I'm going to be showing two projects. First is churches, which I started in 2002 and finished in 2006, and settlements, which I started in 2004. And so I'll be starting with churches, and basically it's a survey of buildings that have accidentally become churches, having all been built for some other use. And there were 3 strands that led to this work. First was in the early 90s. I began to notice adverts on the side of a local church in Willesden where I live. And the pastor had hand-painted these adverts on a big billboard on the side of his church, and they'd say things like eternity, smoking or non-smoking. It's one hell of a decision. And then, go ahead, make my day, come to church, with an image of Clint Eastwood on a horse with guns outstretched. And then, no poll tax in heaven was another good one. And then, try our Sundays, they're better than McDonald's. So that kind of got me noticing this church and the evangelical movement. And the other two strands were finding myself in the late 90s, or firstly finding myself in the late 90s in the relationship with the daughter of an evangelical pastor. And I'd have conversations with him about birthing new churches and his mission in helping and saving people and forming new church-based communities. And around the same time, I was also reading the later works of science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, particularly his accounts of his revelations and mystical Christian experiences, which began in 1974. He tried to work out their authenticity and meaning, and if he could distinguish true revelation from hallucination. And he went on to believe that he'd been invaded by a godlike deity that permeates the universe, which he called VALIS, an acronym for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. And his earlier novels have been sort of redemptive stories in which characters suffered a loss of certainty and a breakdown in their perception of reality, and they'd find themselves reborn into expanded paradigms. And this seemed to me to mirror the evangelical narrative of being born again. So all these strands led me around the millennium to notice just this kind of growth of churches in buildings never designed to be churches. And in 2002 I started work on the project, and this was actually the first slide I took, the first photograph I took. I think I spent about a year thinking about how it would work and working out the distance, and I photographed in a few different ways, and I kind of settled for this across the road distance, which kind of also reflected my position on faith at the time. And although that's kind of shifted from being an atheist to probably an agnostic, but I'd work on a 5:4 shift camera that counts as perspective distortions and distracting angles. You can work against those, and it kind of gives, I like it because it gives a net more of an essence and the feel of a place. Okay, so I'll move on and show you some images. that one we've seen. That's the Alive Chapel above a pub in Green Lanes. So anyway, they record a wide range of sects and denominations called the Charismatic and Evangelical Movement, and it's made up of a mixture of white Afro-Caribbean and African-initiated churches. This was the old Rainbow Theatre in Finsbury Park. And this is the Divine Redeemer's International Deliverance and Healing Centre in Kensal Green. And it's a do-it-yourself spiritual movement, and God is personally experienced, and the narrative of redemption is strong. And dreams, visions and trances are often the chosen media of revelation, which can be powerful and open to interpretation. This is the Kingsway International Centre in Hackney, Wick, which has since been knocked down because the whole Hackney Wick area, or this site particularly, is part of the Olympic redevelopment. I think I was quite aware at the time that I was photographing quite a few places that were, going to disappear. And I think this has one of the largest congregations for an evangelical church in Europe. It was about 7,000 at the time. So it becomes a survey of sort of these accidental buildings and makeshift and the temporary. And each church to me seemed, I found it very unique, and with the architecture beyond the functional need of four walls being redundant, the sort of secondary importance of any architectural aesthetics sort of acted as a metaphor for the importance of the spiritual over the material that you'd expect in a spiritualist church. And none of the traditional church architecture with its symbolism or power, all the traditional church architecture has gone, and here the architecture is just accidental and contingent. That's a Calvary Christian Centre by Carpetwright. And it's kind of, it's sort of like a battle being played out on the commercial landscape between the spiritual and material needs, and sort of secularization versus evangelical re-enchantment. That's a church above a church above a self-storage place on Old Kent Road. The Winner's Temple. And there's a wonderful amount of lovely juxtapositions that you couldn't dream up. So here's the Overcomers Assembly above a betting shop that's in a building that used to be a pub. And there's a church above a job centre in Deptford. I remember talking to a pastor, and he was almost apologising about some locations for his churches, but said, "Oh, it's really important, that we're where we need to be." So there's sort of a lot of pragmatism involved. That's Clays Lane Christian Centre, which is also in the Olympic development zone, so it's gone. And I should say they're mainly within the M25, apart from 2 or 3, and this is one of them, which are outside St Albans. This was actually the last photograph I think I did in the series, and I almost didn't see it. I was photographing a church on the other side of the road from that, just outside the door, and then I turned around and noticed the little cross in the window. And yeah, this one I like. It's unity work. So at first it's describing a place of work, but when it becomes a church, all of a sudden works becomes a verb for unity, and unity works. And this is one of 3 or 4 churches that are in cinemas and theatres that temporarily become a church on a Sunday morning. So in the Genesis Cinema on Stepney Road is screen 1 is the Christ Revival Church, screen 2 is New Frontiers. And there's a sense of humour having a church in the Comedy Store on Sunday mornings. And the Dominion round the corner is an Australian church called Hillsong. That's Jesus House, which is in the old RAC building at the bottom of the M1 at Brent Cross. That's the Eternal Life, which seems to be sort of squashed into a third of a floor above an import-export company. And to begin with, I knew about sort of 10, 15 churches when I started working on the project, and or maybe about 15 or 20, but when I started, a lot of congregants would tell me about other places I should go and have a look at, other churches I should see, and so that sort of helped. But then I got into looking on the internet for, there's a website called Find a Church, so I'd look on there, and then I'd sort of cross-reference with the A to Z, and if there wasn't a cross in the A to Z, I'd know it was probably a reused building. This is one street with 3 churches in. That's the South London Temple. That's the Truth of God Church, which is on the ground floor in that little blue fronted part. And that had gone about six or 7 months later. It had been knocked down and developed into some flats. And I finished this in about 2006 and published it in a book form with Steidl, and this was the last picture in the series, and there are about 63 in total. And just before I move on, I'd say just say that I'm having an exhibition at the National Media Museum in Bradford next April. So if anyone's up there, I'm going to be showing about 36 or 40 images. So I'll now move on to settlements. And it's an ongoing series of photographs of self-built homes and structures in a number of low-impact ecological communities based in Britain, which I've been visiting regularly since 2004. And the roots of this project lay in a random visit I made to a permaculture garden at a music festival in 1995. And I met a group of people who built a wooden bender, which is a small structure of bent and tied wooden poles, covered in insulation and then tarpaulin in which to live. And they were planning on setting up an experimental community to explore low-impact living along with permaculture. And they were saying that they were aiming to be partially self-sufficient and for their way of life to have minimal ecological footprint. And they'd use renewable energy sources, and building materials would be mostly recycled and locally sourced. The term low impact was coined and articulated by Simon Fairley, and is a member of this community, in his 1996 book called Low Impact Development, as a development that by its low environmental impact either enhances or does not significantly diminish environmental quality. And permaculture is a land use design system that originated in Australia in the 70s, and it's a holistic approach to designing human settlements, and in particular perennial agricultural systems that mimic the structure and interrelationships found in natural ecologies. One of the main concepts is that sustainable agriculture underpins a sustainable society. Industrial agriculture tends towards monocrops, while permaculture tends towards maximising diversity through replicating natural systems, encouraging biodiversity and soil health, and it moves towards a system in which human beings are a complementary part of the natural landscape. And at around the same time, well, in 2002, I was getting into lake swimming and the sensation of being literally immersed in the natural environment. And this led me to thinking about how structures we build isolate us from the organic environment. And I was thinking about the effect of a more sensual exposure to the environment to be gained from living in a more simple structure. So that's why this slide is up for that reason at this time. It doesn't get more simple than that. But that was James's temporary setup for a coppicing weekend at Tinker's Bubble community. Anyway, so I got thinking about the community I've met in the permaculture garden and decided to try and find them and see what had happened. So in early 2004, I got in touch with some communities, and in July of that year, I arrived at Steward Community Woodland, for a volunteers work weekend where I made the following photograph. It was just amazing to see a home. This is actually a communal structure, communal space, just engulfed in foliage in a woodland. And I kind of felt like I'd entered this parallel reality. It's quite a powerful experience. So I'll just give you a quick history of Steward Wood. It was founded in 2000 as a cooperative based on permaculture and vegan principles to combine woodland conservation management techniques with sustainable living. And it was set up by two groups of people who connected together in 1998. A couple were working on the McDonald's libel case, and the rest were living in benders at Lyminge Forest Environmental Protest. And they'd come to appreciate living simply and in close contact with the natural environment. And afterwards, they didn't want to go back to living in an unsustainable, high-impact way in mainstream society, and decided to instead to explore building a low-impact community. And this need to create and live in an alternative to the high-impact consumer society is a thread that connects all the communities I've been photographing in. So in late 1999, they collectively purchased a 32-acre woodland and orchard on the edge of a small village within Dartmoor Park, National Park, and then moved on to the land on Earth Day, 22nd of April 2000, without planning permission, and applied retrospectively after 28 days. They were eventually granted 5 years temporary planning permission in 2002 after a public inquiry and a number of appeals. The final appeal was by Dartmoor National Parks Authority at the Royal Courts of Justice against the second planning inspector's decision to reverse the original planning inspector's decision to refuse permission, which is pretty complicated. And it comprises of, the community comprises of 10 adults and 7 children. Electrical energy comes from solar cells and a water turbine. Coppice wood is burnt for cooking and heating. And income is from the woodland, running educational courses and local environmental, community and care work. And children are home educated and organic food is grown. And decisions are made on a consensus basis. So I'll move on and show you some pictures. That's the old kitchen. That was Ben's tree house, which was a very early structure. I think it was built soon after they moved on, but no one actually realised that it wasn't a good idea to build connected to a tree that would blow around in the wind, and it sort of slowly became unstable and was dismantled. This is John and Daisy on the platform starting. They just moved in and starting to build. So anyway, my approach was to photograph in a similar way to the church's work, but this sort of slowly evolved. Well, the same approach being a structure with some of its environment around at a sort of similar distance. But it slowly evolved as I got to know the communities to include infrastructure, interiors, and communal portraits, and the changing seasons. That's Pete's. That's the longhouse, which was the first structure we saw from a different perspective, a lower perspective, in the winter. That's Merlin and Becky's, which is most of the year almost invisible in the woods, but in November I could just about take a picture. And that was the first communal portrait I took. Less Merlin. There was a point in 2005 when the numbers in the community got a little low. A few people had left, and but it soon picked up, as you'll see. That's the inside the longhouse, and that's the communal computer and office space. That's Jamie in the bathhouse stoking up the fire. That's inside the longhouse after a rebuild. That's John, Sonia and Daisy's. That was the structure that you saw from above earlier that was with a couple of people on it, on the platform. That's it in April 2008, and then just 2 months later, that's it in June 2008. Now the original planning permission was really restrictive, and the structures had to be temporary and covered in tarpaulin, and it's held back the community from building structures with a higher thermal mass. But despite that, the carbon footprint of Steward wood was measured in 2007 as 30% of the national average. That was the communal garden, communal growing area very early on. And that's a more recent communal portrait. And yeah, the temporary planning permission expired in 2007, and an application for a further 5 years was denied by the National Parks Authority, even though they had a lot of local support. That led to another appeal and a public inquiry held in 2008, at which the planning inspector granted permission. And he said that the venture had evolved into an educational resource, providing what is in effect a demonstration of permaculture principles being applied in practice, and is of significant wider benefit. And he also said, having regard to the almost total reliance on renewable energy sources and reclaimed reused materials, I believe that development meets many of the national policy objectives concerning sustainable development. So I'm now going to move on to Brithdeer Moor, which is in Pembrokeshire, which was founded in 1994 on a 165-acre farm, and is mixed to a number of projects aiming at sustainability, including 2 self-built projects I've been photographing, Tate Britain, which means spirit land, and Tony and Jane's Roundhouse. So this is the wood part of the farm. And they've also had their battle with the planning authority, Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, and they began fighting. This is Tony and Jane's, and they began fighting demolition orders after this structure was discovered from the air in 1998 due to sun reflecting on the solar panel. You can just see the solar panel at the top there. And this is Emma's straw bale roundhouse, or Emma and John's. And at an appeal in 2005 against another demolition, at an appeal in 2005 against the demolition order, Emma pinned up this photograph alongside a picture of a huge agricultural barn given permission on nearby land owned by a councillor to demonstrate the visual inconsistencies of the planning laws, but to no effect, and the demolition order remained. But later that year, in a pre-court hearing for a residents' injunction against the demolition, the park was ordered to defer demolition after the judge pointed out that the park themselves were about to introduce a new policy on low-impact development under Welsh Assembly directives the following year in July 2006. So Tia Brisdell and Tony and Jane applied for planning permission under that policy, and after 2 more refusals, they finally were granted 3 years temporary planning permission. I should also, I meant to say, there was a point in 2002 when Tony and Jane nearly gave up. There was a bulldozer on site with a demolition order, and supporters had come from 3 or 4 other communities, and they occupied the roundhouse to stop the demolition. And Tony and Jane were so touched that they sort of decided to fight on. And so anyway, they eventually got permission, 3 years temporary permission in 2008. This was Brigham's, and this is the same building. Brigham moved into a yurt, and that reverted to being communal space. And this is Tony and Jane's from another view in the winter time. I've got a little bit more planning stuff to say, but it's important because it sort of determines who's allowed access to the land and their effect on the environment. And since the Town and Country Planning Act in 1947, planning laws have been based on the assumption that all forms of development, except agricultural, are an urban threat to the countryside. This was to protect and visually preserve the countryside, but agricultural exemptions prioritise large-scale industrial farming at great ecological cost and social cost. It's denied many low-impact projects permission on aesthetic grounds, and its inability to recognise subsistence farming as viable. A low-impactor supplying most of his or her needs from the land can get by on a turnover of £2,000 to £3,000. Yet planners perceive a sustainable agricultural turnover to be much higher, often around £15,000. And there's also no means to measure the ecological and other economically non-tangible benefits of low-impact living. So this raises question about whose values and aesthetics dominate the landscape and who is allowed access to live and work on the land, a battle that stretches back centuries to the Enclosures Act. Values were reordered very slightly in a landmark court case in 1999 by some low-impact smallholders, Petters and Harris, in a court case versus the Secretary of State and Chichester Council, and the court ruled that subsistence agriculture should be regarded as being potentially viable. So in the mid-1990s, a number of low impactors formed organisations called the Land is Ours and Chapter 7 to offer planning advice on low impact development. They've also been pressing for changes in planning laws and its application to allow space for low impact development as a solution to issues of sustainability, low cost housing and rural regeneration. And they created and made available model planning policies along with criteria for sustainable development for submission to various Department of Environment and Welsh Assembly consultations. Success has been negligible in England, but in Wales things have been pretty positive as part of the Assembly's commitment to the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. In 2002, due to the ongoing battles with Tony Wrench and others, the Welsh Assembly and Pembrokeshire National Park commissioned 2 research projects on low impact development. The first concluded that criteria-based national and local planning policies be developed for low impact development in Wales. The second paper led to Low Impact Development Policy 52, which was adopted in 2006 by Pembrokeshire County Council, setting out a clear framework for allowing development in the countryside for exemplars of sustainable living. It was through this policy that the residents of Bradford got 3 years temporary planning permission, but not till after 2 more applications. I'll now carry on with some slides. So this is a communal portrait up at Bradford. That's Emma on the left and Brent and his 2 daughters, and Tony and Jane on the right. And this is the interior of Tony's roundhouse, which is a double henge structure with a self-supporting reciprocal beam roof, which I'll talk about later a bit more. This is inside one of Emma's straw bale roundhouses. And this is a cordwood roundhouse built recently. And that's Emma in her garden last September, with it looking very lush and productive. I'm now going to move on to Tinker's Bubble in Somerset. And this was founded in 1994 on a small holding with the objective of creating sustainable livelihoods with a minimal environmental impact. It's also had a long planning battle, and it took till January 1999 for Tinkers to get 5 years temporary planning consent. This was renewed for 10 years in 2004. It's 43 acres of conifer plantation, orchards and gardens, and is home to 10 adults and 7 children approximately. And electricity is from solar cells and wind generators. They've got a wood-powered sawmill, and coppice wood is burnt for heating and cooking. Water's pumped from a spring, and they have 1 shire horse for logging and field work, and no fossil fuel engines are used on the land. Incomes from organic market farming, greenwoods crafts, value-added products derived from the land, and work in the local green economy. The community is run by consensus decision making. So, yeah, Tinkers is probably the oldest community I've been photographing, the longest standing, and there's quite a variation in structures from sort of straw bale, semi-straw bale, with bender roofs, to log cabins. This is Peter's, which was previously built by B. And this is the prospective members bender and the wind and solar electric storage bender. If you're joining the community, you do 3 or 4 months in the prospective members bender while you're figuring out if you want, while the community's figuring out that whether they're happy for you to join. This is Mary and Joe's. and this is the Woofers Guest House. And woofing, if you don't know, it stands for Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. And it's a system, it's an organisation that you can volunteer as a woofer and you register, and communities and farms register as hosts, and it puts you together and you go and volunteer, work for 4 or 5 hours a day, and you get your board and lodging. But it's a way of visiting Tinker's Bubble and experiencing life there, being part of the community. That's the communal roundhouse and kitchen. And that was the first communal portrait I did. Left Steve, James, Dave, Debbie and Pearl. And that's the communal fire pit. All cooking is done pretty much when the weather's good over an open fire, and they eat communally every day. That's the communal kitchen. It's inside one of the cabins. That's Michael's. That was built by Di and Jyoti, who left, went on to set up a small farm called Five Penny Farm with a couple of other members. And this is the bathhouse. And this was started off as Shannon, Chris and Alex's under construction in February 2005. And that's the same structure from the opposite side when it was finished, and it would become Krina, Petal and Minis. And that's one of the more recent built sort of cabin and roundhouse building structures. That's inside, and that's Baby Pip in the bottom right. And that's the prospective members bender when Charlotte and Nevie and her daughter Nevie were in there. They later joined the community and she built a new building, but I haven't got a picture of it in this series here today. And that's a more recent communal portrait, July 2008. And that's the wood-fueled steam-powered sawmill, which is used for the planking that builds the cabins. And the blade is just on the left there, you can just about make it out. And it was originally built to go to, I think it was built to go to India, and was built as a wood-burning steam engine. And it was built around the turn of the century, and it stayed in someone's barn since then, and somehow this person got in touch with Tinker's Bubble and said, hey, do you want this wood-powered, steam-powered sawmill? And they said, yep, and the guy gave it to them. This was haymaking. And this is one of the members' gardens. And so yeah, a few of the residents are market gardeners, or quite a few, and they do a sort of local vegetable box scheme, and then they sell at local farmers markets. That's Pete in his polytunnel. I was woofing that July, and those are my garlics which I picked and washed and tied up. And that's the Russett's Communal Garden and Cowshed. Okay, now move on to Land Matters, which is a cooperative in Devon. And they moved onto the land in 2005. And it's comprised of approximately 42 acres, 17 acres of woodland, 22 acres of pasture. And they were granted 3 years temporary planning permission in August 2007 after another long battle and an appeal. That expired, and they're now in the process of seeking further temporary planning permission. It's approximately 11 to 12 adults and 5 to 6 children. And they're mainly a community living in Benders. That was an early communal portrait. I think they just finished putting in the appeal for the planning application. And that's inside the communal barn. And inside Rue's Bender. The Benders are really beautiful structures to be in. You sort of feel like you're under a canopy of trees. That's Josh, Celine and Sasha and Melodies. And that's a new communal yurt and communal space under construction to the back right there. And communal portrait from November 2008. And that's a more recent view of the main field, which is turning into a really lush garden area. And now this is a section called Locations Undisclosed. People are happy for me to photograph, but wish to retain their privacy, and they're in a number of different places. That's a double roundhouse. This is Vaney building a roundhouse, and that's a good picture to see the self-supporting reciprocal roof being built, and that was in September 2008, and this was 2 years later from the same position, finished, almost finished, and a double roundhouse. That's an interior. And then finally on to Lammers, and these last 3 images, which is one of 2 new entities, communities I've been documenting that have grown out of the existing communities, the other being Five Penny Farm. It's in Pembrokeshire, and it's unique because it's the first community that's succeeded in getting planning permission before moving onto the land. It consists of 9 low-impact smallholdings on a 76-acre site. They applied under the new Policy 52 in mid-2007, but were turned down twice, finally got permission on appeal in August 2009 and moved on. And they've since been working on their smallholdings and buildings. This is Paul and Hoppy's. And this is Simon and Jasmine's. And this is they're living in this at the moment, but it's just really eventually going to be a storeroom and workspace when he builds, until he builds a main dwelling. That's inside. And that's a reciprocal self-supporting roof and a cob floor and straw bale walls. So anyway, one final planning thing. In 2009, the Welsh Assembly after circulating a draft policy called One Planet Development, took on board several ideas proposed by Chapter 7, and in July 2010 issued a national planning guidance, TAN 6, titled Planning for Sustainable Rural Communities. It has a section titled One Planet Development, which takes forward low-impact development as a solution to issues of sustainability, low-cost housing, and rural regeneration. So anyway, the communities I've depicted in settlements represent a radical here-and-now attempt to live in a less material and more constructive way with the natural environment. I've seen in people's responses to these photographs reflections of the politics and values they bring to viewing them. To some, these images are disturbing, but to others, and I'm one, they're beautiful, hopeful, and inspiring. Thank you very much.
I think I've got a sort of comment, I think, rather than a question. But what I think is interesting about these two series seen like this together is that something about what you said about sort of low impact housing integrating into the environment and being kind of inserted into the environment that it is already existing. And that is the same for both of the series. So the churches are sort of being inserted into the city environment in a sort of almost in a sort of low impact way, because they're just colonizing buildings which are already there and spaces which are already there. And obviously these are at the same time. And it was just interesting, I thought, that you were sort of applying almost a sort of a sense of the picturesque onto the cityscape in a similar kind of way. Some of your compositions and things looked very, very much like a sort of traditional landscape composition or painting as well. But perhaps I wondered if you could say a bit about that.
Well, it's a very good observation, and it is true. They do both slip in a very invisible way.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, but with low impact developments and structures, using local materials from the ground, it's and natural materials. It blends in and is almost invisible. And the churches, apart from the signage, are invisible, and sometimes from the pictures you spend a bit of time wondering where they are, finding where they are.
Mm-hmm. Was that is that a conscious thing? I mean, did the churches came first?
The churches came first. I'm not sure, but I think they're just attributes of the two of them, both of them.
Yeah. You got any? I'm going to run and give you the microphones. Oh, okay. I don't have to.
Hello. I was just curious. I don't know whether it's the images you selected to show us, but that the more established communities had buildings which looked more like traditional houses. Is that an impression that you've got from visiting these places?
Well, the round houses, I don't think are too much like traditional houses, but I think you mainly think of Tinker's Bubble and the wooden cabins. And I guess they do appear as more traditional houses, but they are low impact. They are built from local, the materials from the woodland, and therefore blend in very well with the landscape. But yes, they do look like more like traditional houses, but they're, in many ways they're not. They're off grid. The whole water, waste systems are different, and it might visually appear to look like a house, a traditional house, but in many ways it is, but in many ways it isn't.
Well, I was going to say, perhaps it's because this kind of movement has become more, has grown, and so the sort of understanding of housing, of this kind of housing, has developed along with it. So the sort of older projects perhaps are the sort of very the ones which are more traditional in that way? You know.
Well, the older structures are very simple, very easy, and very cheap to erect, and people have, you know, I suppose low impact buildings developed and moved on, but you know, a lot of people still choose to build a bender and live in a bender. They're quite happy in there.
Could I just ask, David, with both series, certainly with the churches, I mean, I know there must be a finite amount of these things in one particular area, but with both, it seems like you've covered a lot of ground with both. Is it a case that you get to a point where there are simply no structures left to photograph, or how do you know that a project feels finished? Either of these two?
Right. Well, I think with the churches, I got to the point where I think it's when you get to the point where you feel that you're repeating yourself, and that's probably the point where you could consider. I would consider it finished or complete. Once I've explored as much as I can. But then I haven't ruled out going back and photographing some more churches, and I see lots regularly, and I think, oh, yeah, I might go and take a picture. And the same, well, the settlements is still ongoing, and I don't know what my plans are. It's kind of got to the point where it feels ready to, I'd like to make a publication of some sort. Yeah. It's definitely got to that point. But I don't know after that what's going to happen, but I'm sort of planning to carry on taking pictures.
And have there ever been incidences, where the communities have put these images to any use because they're incredibly seductive? I mean, they're quite fairy tale-like, that you I'm sure, you know, you portray them in quite a wonderful light. Are these images of any use to the communities in either promoting themselves or helping, you know, perhaps gain these planning permissions that they're having such difficulty in getting, or have they been put to any use for them, I guess?
Well, Emma showed the picture of her place at one of the planning appeals, and so they have been used, and I give them copies of everything, and quite often they use the pictures if they're giving a talk about themselves, or you know, having a display board, or at some event or festival. They'll use the pictures and in reports and on their websites, and yeah, so quite a lot, and I find them extremely beautiful places, and you know, I'm just reflecting what I see when I go there in my photographs. Yeah.
Do you think if you go back and photograph the churches, will you try and take similar community type pictures from those churches? I mean, that's one of the big differences, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. No, it'd just be the structures again. It would just be the architectural side of it.
Just the keeping of the outside.
Yeah. I think so.
Thanks. Following on from that last point, did you meet people from the churches, from all of the ones you went to, and did you go inside them, or were you photographing them from the outside?
I meet people, I talk to them, people come out and ask me what they were doing, had some really interesting conversations. And I really got the impression that churches was kind of fulfilling a need for people that wasn't being filled in society. You know, the churches were there doing it, you know, community, and for a lot of people, community, and just helping people sort out their lives, getting them on track, and then also very, very kindly, I was prayed for. I was invited in and prayed for a couple of times, and you know, prayed for me and the success of the project, which was very, very sweet. So.
Hi, David. I was just wondering, in relation to churches, whether or not if you got a sense from speaking to the communities, because there's a real diversity of building types, but what the criteria were that the community had for choosing a building, deciding which building they were going to occupy.
Yeah. Well, the only conversation I did have about that was I was speaking to a pastor and, you know, asking him about his churches, and he was saying, you know, we're opening one up in a nightclub in the middle of, I can't remember what it was, maybe it was Portsmouth, and he said, you know, and he sort of apologised that it was a nightclub, but he said it's right where we need to be. It's right in the part of town where people need help. So there's this sort of pragmatism of just being in the right place. And other things I can only sort of speculate on, you know, why they might be there. But I think it's mainly about, well, another thing is you can't build a new church in London, can you, anymore? I mean, it's hard to get planning permission and to raise funds, so it becomes pragmatic to recycle an old building to move into something else. I hope that answers